Okay. We got all the panelists seated. We are about to start. Good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the WTO seminar on food security. We are about to start the event, and I propose to you first to give the floor virtually to the WTO Director General, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, for some opening remarks. Now it should start.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to our seminar today on trade and food security. This critical issue has long been on the WTO agenda, but recent developments have given the topic new urgency as we prepare for our 12th Ministerial Conference in June. Our goal today is to provide a space for dialogue on trade and food security among Geneva-based delegates, international experts, and capital-based officials. And the high-level participation we have today is testimony to the seriousness with which the international community is taking this issue. But before we begin, I would like to say a few words on the topic which is before us today. As participants will be aware, the issue of trade and food security has shot to the top of the global policy agenda. The UN Secretary General has recently set up a global crisis response group on food, energy, and finance, in which the WTO participates. Drawing on the group's recommendations, the Secretary General has urged countries to keep food markets open, avoid unjustified export restrictions, and make reserves available to countries at risk of hunger and famine. The most recent data released by the FAO shows that food prices have hit record highs. These price spikes are undermining the food security of poor consumers, especially in importing developing countries. This means that the recent outbreak of conflict in Ukraine has not only created a serious humanitarian crisis, it has also exacerbated the global food security challenges we are facing. Both Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of grains such as wheat and maize and of vegetable oils. The two countries together account for around 1/4 of all traded wheat and around 3/4 of the world's exports of crude sunflower oil. In addition, Russia accounts for nearly 1/10 of fuel exports, and together with Belarus, 1/5 of the world's supply of fertilizer. Households in Africa and the Middle East are particularly vulnerable to disruptions in these supplies. 35 countries in Africa import food, and 22 import fertilizer from Russia, Ukraine, or both countries. Some depend heavily on the two exporters for key staples like wheat. Even before the war began, the FAO had estimated that between 720 million and 811 million people in the world faced hunger in 2020. Many more were burdened with other forms of malnutrition. The current price spikes thus come on top of challenges due to the pandemic, economic downturns, climate-related shocks, and other conflicts around the world. Trade thus has a central role to play in addressing the food security challenges we face today. It can help move food around the world from places with a surplus to those with a deficit. Trade can help improve access to food by creating jobs and raising incomes. It can help meet rising demand for more diverse, nutritious food. And well-functioning global food markets can improve predictability and stability for both producers and consumers. At the WTO, trade negotiators are very conscious of these questions as they prepare for our 12th Ministerial Conference in June. I'm confident that today's event will help us to deepen our understanding of the issues at stake. My hope is that it will enable WTO members to take concrete steps forward so that trade can contribute to the attainment of food security in all countries and help improve people's lives around the world. Thank you.
So welcome again, everyone. As the DG has noted just in her opening remarks, the issue of trade and food security has shot to the top of today's global policy agenda. Conflicts, climate change, economic downturn have made it even more urgent to address this issue in a world that is still reeling from the pandemic. However, with today's seminar, we intend to take a more technical approach, and we would really like to make a deep dive into the interaction between trade policy and food security. Our objective is here to provide a forum to share technical experiences and exchange views on how WTO members could take concrete steps towards reinforcing the role of trade in attaining global food security and improving people's lives. During this morning session, we will hear from 3 panels made up of trade officials from WTO members, experts from international organizations, and academia. Let me take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for agreeing to be here today in person or virtually, especially since your busy schedules. We are grateful for your presence and for being able to benefit from your experience and expertise in the field of food security.
Well, we now move on the third panel, which looked at the food security issue from an academic perspective. Let me introduce the 4 distinguished speakers. We will hear presentations from the following 2 academics. Dr. Sachin Kumar Sharma, appreciate to be here, of the Center of WTO Studies, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and Peter Draper of the Institute of International Trade, University of Adelaide, is by Zoom. It's here?
Yes.
Okay. After their presentations, we will hear comments from 2 experienced government officials, Ambassador Stephen DeBoer from Canada and Ambassador Muhammadou Kah, the Gambia. Before giving the floor to panelists, I would like to remind once more that the participants following YouTube can pose their questions by sending an email to the Q&A mailbox on the WTO webpage dedicated to today's event. With that, let me give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Sharma. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, ma'am, for providing me this opportunity. I'm going to give my views on public stockholding on food security. Next. Okay, globally, more than 800 million people are suffering from severe food insecurity. And many of these people are residing in developing, including LDC countries. And a majority of the farmers in this country are low income and resource poor farmers who face multiple challenges in terms of insufficient institutional support, small farm size, price fluctuations. And many of these countries implement public stockholding program to ensure food security with the objective to provide affordable food to vulnerable section of the society, then stabilizing the agriculture prices and ensure remunerative prices to the farmers to enhance their purchasing power. Next. There are many countries who are implementing or had implementing the public stockholding programs. They are from Latin American countries, Asian, African countries, like China, India, Zambia, there are Philippines, Pakistan. There are many countries who are implementing the price support-backed public stockholding programs. And if these countries account for more than 51% of the world population and more than 47% of the undernourished people in the world, there are many products which are covered under the public stockholding because it varies country to country, region to region, and time to time. But rice, maize, wheat, pulses, millet, soybean, these are some of the products which are covered under the public stockholding programs. Next. Now, regarding the importance of the public stockholding program, what is the importance for the developing country? Now, I give the example of India. In 1943, India witnessed the Great Bengal Famine, where more than 3 million people died due to hunger, starvation, and famine-related disease. It is the significance of the PSS that after independence, India not witnessed any any Bengal famine-like situation, despite witnessing drought in some of the years. Next. Now, significance of PSA also can be assessed on the ability of the foreign exchange reserve. In 1964-65, India was a net food importing country, and we used to import more than 38% of the domestic consumption of wheat we were importing. That time, our foreign exchange reserve were about $500 million US, which was equivalent to the imported value of wheat that time. Now, that time, the US government helped us by giving us assistance under the PL 480. So that's why India able to ensure the food security that time. Now, if that were not there, then how can a country can spend whole its foreign exchange reserve only to import one commodity? And that's compel India, and this was one of the reasons to go for the public stockholding programs. The situation what India faced in 1960s, there are many countries which recently they also grappled with the same situation. In Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and many African countries which have the low level of foreign exchange reserve, maybe they are facing this kind of situation. Next. Now, PSS not only ensure the domestic food security, but also global food security. I give the example, in 2002 and 3, there was a drought situation in India and the rice production declined by 23%. Rather than depending on importing the food grains from the international market, India used the PSS stock to ensure the food security. Now, it is to be noted that rice is a thinly traded commodity, and about 7 to 8% of global production is traded in the international market. And if that time India entered in the international market to import food grains, then almost 80 to 90% of global export would be vanished. And because India has to satisfy the need for its people. It clearly shows that if a large country like India in a crisis enter in the international market, it can hamper the food security of other countries. So PSS plays a very, very important role. Next. Even PSS significance also important during the food crisis where China, Indonesia, and India able to stabilize the prices during the food crisis, and even in the ongoing pandemic, where due to lack of economic activity, many people, they were facing the food insecurity. And this time the government has used the public stockholding programs to implement the welfare schemes. In India, the government implemented Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana, under which free fruit grains were distributed to the poor people. And this in addition to what we are distributing under the National Food Security Act 2013. And where more than 800 million people are covered under this scheme. So see the scope and significance of the public stockholding. Next. Yeah, 1 minute. Now, here the one important thing I want to talk, that this PSS is an integral part of the food security, and food security is indispensable to the national food security. And why it's important? Because it leads to the peace, social rest, and also help in implementing right to food. Next. Now, I wanted to quote one of the prominent leaders in the world. What he said, it's important for our nation to build, to grow foodstuff, to feed our people. Can you imagine a country that was unable to grow enough food to feed the people? It would be a nation that would be subject to international pressure. It would be a nation at risk. And who said this? Not leader from the developing or LDC country. Next, former US President George W. Bush. And I am totally agree with this statement, because this is very, very important for the national security. Next. Now, coming on this food security and agreement on agriculture, why the developing countries are facing the problem? There are two issues. One, that most of the developing countries' limit to support has been capped at 10% of value of production due to their commitment under the Uruguay round. The other issue, how the public stockholding program, the support has been calculated under the agreement on agriculture. And it's surprising that if you wanted to calculate the sport, for instance, if India or Kenya or Pakistan is announcing any market price sport, then how is calculated? It's calculated by comparing current applied administered price with external reference price, which is determined 40 years back, 35 to 40 years back, that's 90, 86, 88. And based on this, the market price sport is calculated, and the amount should be less than the de minimis limit for the many of the developing countries because they don't have the AMS entitlement. Now, if this is the formula, then it will give very highly exaggerated sport level. It provides a distorted picture of the level of sport in the developing country, and which is used to undermine the significance of the public stockholding in the negotiation. Next. I give the example of Nepal. The Nepal has announced the minimum spot price for paddy. And if I convert into rice, then it is coming around 42,000 Nepali rupees per ton. I have calculated the external reference for Nepal. This is coming around 12,000 Nepali rupees per ton. Now, as per the MPS calculation, the per ton spot for under the AOA would be around 30,000 Nepali rupees per ton. Can Nepali government can go to the farmer and say that much support is given? No, because it's highly exaggerated because inflation has not been considered in this. And how is constraining? The constraining is that with the ERP, with the MSP announced, the level of procurement, the maximum the Nepal government can procure is up to 14% of their domestic production. And when I calculated in 2016, it was around 16.5. And this decline. Why is decline? Because due to the increase in the MSP, minimum support price, and which he compared with the fixed external reference price. Next. Now take the case of the Indonesia. It's surprising that in case of Indonesia, the rice external reference price was 370 Indonesia rupee per kg. And now what is the applied administered price? It is around 7,300. That is 1900% of the external reference price, which gives highly exaggerated figure. Now, as a government officer, if we don't get the deer allowances annually, we go and do the protest. And for the farmers, what we are thinking, we are calculating a sport, which is by comparing the current level of MSP with a price which calculated 35 to 40 years back. Is give highly distorted picture of the level of sport. And I agree in the morning session where that there need to be something on the measurement of market price sport. Now, if we wanted to see the realistic picture, maybe the one way, maybe to consider the inflation, that how inflation has increased since 1986, 88 over the 35. And if we consider it, then what will be the result? Next. Now I calculated for some of the countries here. Now in case of Kenya, you see that in 1986 till now, inflation index with a base year of 1986, 88 is equal to 100, has increased to 3,000. 3,000, this is the index. And if we consider the inflation, what we see the picture in nominal terms, the calculation that countries are giving high level of support, the per adjusted per ton support would coming negative, even for China, India, Pakistan, Kenya and Pakistan, and for other countries, even Jordan, this level of support for Jordan and Indonesia will remain below the de minimis limit. So it's very important to have the realistic measurement of the support regarding but through the public stockholding programs. Now next, the other way can be by updating the external reference price. I have taken the external reference price from the OECD data, which they used to calculate the producer support estimate. And if I compare it with MSP for the rice, and it again come negative. It again come negative. So the way in the nominal terms, when we do the calculation and when we do calculation in updated ERP or consider inflation, it gives you totally opposite picture. Like in case of Kenya, can you go to previous slide? In case of Kenya, the per ton support for PSH maize would be around, if consider inflation is 28,000. But if we don't consider inflation, it would come positive 23,000. There's a drastic, this is totally totally different picture you will get it. Next. Next. So I would like to conclude that updating the ERP and adjusting the inflation would reflect the realistic level of the support. And it's also a very important component for the ongoing food security discussion. And also, if a country had the capacity to undertake agriculture, import of food grains can't be a substitute for government procurement of domestic food grains. PSH has a very important role in the developing country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for your comprehensive and excellent overview of the food security challenges and responses of one of the world's most populous countries. And I will now give the floor to our second speaker, Mr. Draper, to present his perspective on food security issues and policy response. Dr. Draper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. This is the last formal presentation in a very rich and full day. I think we've seen a very rich set of technical analyses, but also of policy prescriptions, international policy prescriptions, on which there's been substantial convergence, particularly on measures such as, well, restricting export restrictions, but also provision of finance in targeted ways to those countries least able to deal with the effects of the current food price crisis. And for me, I think what all of those presentations have reinforced is the importance of the international division of labor and the role that international trade plays with that, and hence the importance of preserving the system. But as we've just heard from the last speaker, there's also a need to reform the system. And by system, I'm talking particularly about the WTO. But I think also, and understandably, given the sources of the presentations, international institutions, which have to be neutral in their observations and technical, what we've suffered a little from is the absence of political economy perspectives. And I wanted to just quickly give some perspectives on that. And really to divide this into two levels, and very high levels of that, domestic, but also international political economy. And underlying this thrust is the how question. So I think we would all agree that we need to reform the way in which agricultural trade is governed, and I'll come back to that right at the end. But the question is how to do it, given these, in some cases, very obvious political economy constraints. And probably the best way to think about this, I think, was captured very neatly in the last presentation. And that is that when most people, or maybe not most, but when many people speak about food security, actually what they have in mind is food sovereignty. That's something that we haven't really explicitly discussed today. And I think the two should be analytically distinguished. In my view, there's many countries in the world that are not in a position, really, from an economic perspective, or even a climate perspective, to produce all of their own food supply. I think of a country like Namibia, for instance, in Southern Africa, which I've done a fair bit of work on, which is mostly desert, but has in place still quite an inward-looking and protectionist agricultural trade regime. And that is because the logic of their policy is one of food sovereignty, which is, in a sense, disguised as food security. And then the question becomes, why do governments go this food sovereignty route? And generally that would be because they're either looking to protect consumers, particularly poor consumers. I think, for instance, of the export restrictions that Indonesia has just imposed on palm oil, which have already been referenced. That is in the name of domestic consumers, of which there are many, and of course voters in Indonesia. And Indonesia is not the only exponent of this, but probably it is the most recent and currently a very significant one. But also to protect producers, whether that be through schemes such as public stockholding or through the various forms of agricultural subsidies paid out in the developed countries and in a number of sizable developing countries such as India, but also China and a handful of others. And so if we think about how that plays out in terms of instruments, on the subsidies front, there are essentially, I would argue, 10 key offenders when it comes to the payments of subsidies or domestic support in its various forms. And that's a pretty small group of countries, actually. And a lot of those subsidies are concentrated on the kinds of products that we've been talking about today, the staple food products. And what do those subsidies do? They distort market signals. Now, if I relate this back to the presentation given by the representative from the African Development Bank, where the essence of, or one of the essences of his presentation was that the bank wants to promote food systems resilience, which in a way is a nod towards food sovereignty. The problem with subsidies is they make it very difficult for African countries to do so, because African countries don't have the deep pockets that these primarily 10 big subsidizers do. They have the fiscal capacity to pay their farmers large sums of money. Many African countries don't. And perhaps something that we haven't really spoken about today is that the international financial environment, the monetary environment, is deteriorating on a daily basis. Interest rates are going up around the world. The cost of capital is increasing. As the IMF recently warned, many countries are likely to face sovereign debt as well as domestic debt crises on top of food price crises that we're now experiencing, and therefore won't be in a position to pay out the kinds of subsidies that are being proposed by certain or in certain quarters. So I think we need to be quite careful in how we think about these matters. Also, if one thinks about import tariffs, which are still relevant in some countries most exposed, for instance, to the Ukraine conflict, some of those countries still rely on import duties to prop up their fiscal revenues. So yes, it makes absolute sense for them to get rid of those tariffs in order to bring down the price of food, assuming that the reduction in taxes would be transmitted to consumers, and that raises issues about distribution, logistics, and what economists call pass-through effects. But it's difficult if you rely on particular import products for tariff revenues, which then fund your fiscus. And that's a particular problem in poor countries, but developing countries more broadly. And of course, many of those import tariffs are also there to produce or to protect domestic producers, which comes back to the political economy, and who is arguing often for these kinds of food sovereignty policies, whether they be import duties or subsidies. It's very often the producers that stand to benefit from them. And that's before we get to the international political economy, which is getting more and more difficult by the day. And I liked the World Food Programme's framing of this, the 4 C's. Well, one I would emphasize in this particular set of remarks is the deteriorating geoeconomic environment. And we've already seen outside of agriculture in a range of dual-use technology-related supply chains, that supply chains are to some extent fracturing as the geoeconomic environment deteriorates. What the Russia-Ukraine conflict has done is to sharpen that process of deterioration and placing big question marks on the future of international cooperation. And I think particularly of the G20, which is still a key coordination forum, but there's a sharp divide right down the middle of the Indonesia-led G20 this year, and I would argue beyond. So how then to achieve WTO cooperation or cooperation in international institutions beyond the WTO in this very difficult political economy environment? I think that's the million-dollar question. I would divide that into two parts, the answer to this into two parts. And so the first is focus on the low-hanging fruit. And there do seem to be some things, policy instruments or processes that could be categorized within that basket. The first, I think, is the issue around information flow. This was raised in the context of AMOS and perhaps not enough information coming out of AMOS. So that was raised by the OECD representative in particular. And clearly, this is relatively uncontroversial and it should be prioritized and actioned, particularly to the extent that it has the capacity to move markets and for markets to overshoot on the basis of access only to the wrong kinds of information. But also the second area of broad consensus that it seemed to me emerge from the morning's presentations was the need to provide international financial support, particularly to the poorest countries. The forms that support takes, grants particularly, that should be emphasized, but who gets the support? Does it go to governments? Very often the governments are weak in an institutional sense. Does it go to charities? All sorts of important questions within that, but that is a key area where there is consensus and relatively low-hanging fruit. And then finally, ending on the WTO in particular, I would like to advocate strongly for a joint statement initiative on agriculture. And in the broad framing of don't waste a crisis, the old economist's maxim. We are, and let's be realistic, we're not going to get root and branch reform of the agricultural trade regime as represented by WTO rules and the Agreement on Agriculture in particular. But it did seem to me that there was clear, at least technical consensus on the need to reform, by which I would understand that to mean to tighten access to export restrictions, especially when it comes to food. There's a broader problem when it comes to export restrictions, but for now, the current heart of the crisis is on food. And then the second broad area I think there needs to be the focus on is on domestic support reforms. And that encompasses a whole package of issues. Many of those issues are deeply intractable, but if there's one area that could receive, I would hope, immediate support, it would be at least to reduce domestic support entitlements, which have grown almost exponentially in recent years. And if those entitlements can be capped and then reduced, that doesn't necessarily reduce actual subsidy payments, by the way, that would also be a relatively low-hanging fruit. And then finally, I think there could be some movement on a broader market access package through this joint statement initiative with a group of like-minded countries. And collectively, export restrictions, domestic support reforms with particular focus on entitlement reductions, and a small market access package focused on those food products that are most affected by the current crises, that could constitute a meaningful contribution from the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Draper, for your excellent presentation. And your presentation has highlighted many issues that I'm sure will trigger some interesting discussions here in this afternoon. And now I'm pleased to turn to our other two speakers for their comments. Ambassador M.O, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, for inviting me to participate in this panel as a discussant, and thank you to the panelists for their presentations. The food security event is timely, and the information shared during this seminar can be used to support further evidence-based technical discussions on trade policy and food security. I'd like to provide and to respond to some comments in the presentations from our two panelists. supporting global food security requires a holistic policy approach and an exploration of all factors important for food security. Food security challenges have been exacerbated by COVID-19. Droughts and floods in major producing nations have led to high prices. Unfortunately, global food security concerns have also been exacerbated and put into serious jeopardy with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This act has significantly curtailed Ukraine's ability as one of the world's top producers and exporters of key agricultural products, including wheat, corn, barley, and sunflower oil to export to global markets. And this current crisis has highlighted the need for a coordinated global response to address food security concerns in both the short term and long term. For our part, Canada believes that short-term and emerging policy responses by WTO members to address immediate food security concerns should follow the principle of do no harm. One example would be to avoid unnecessary export restrictions that can exacerbate already high prices. The WTO can encourage short-term policy responses that would help create a more stable and predictable trading environment and should include improvements in transparency and monitoring of agricultural markets, including through the G20 AMOS, the WTO and its monitoring function, and through the work of the regular committees. Secondly, we can call on members to avoid hoarding and unnecessary stockpiling of traditionally exported crops. Holding back exports or buying more than what is necessary will only exacerbate food security challenges. Finally, WTO members should achieve a multilateral agreement as soon as possible to not apply export restrictions to non-commercial humanitarian purchases by the World Food Programme. It is the least WTO members can do to respond to this crisis. In the medium and longer term, the WTO should play a part in building a more resilient agricultural trading system that can respond to future shocks and help contribute to global food security. At MC12, WTO members can develop a series of agriculture negotiation frameworks that would ultimately achieve a level playing field and create a more resilient international agriculture trading system and rules by reducing members' ability to provide trade distorting domestic support in a proportionate and fair manner. The recently released joint report of the WTO, IMF, and the World Bank highlights the need to take steps to address trade distorting domestic support, creating a more open predictability and create more open predictability and transparency in international markets. Now, on this domestic support part, I would say that this needs to be comprehensive, and we have to look at all aspects of domestic support and reduce distortions. Professor Sharma noted, for example, one aspect, market price support methodology, but only looking at one aspect could actually lead to more distortions. So we would call for something more holistic. And I would say that these actions will put members on the path to improving each dimension of food security, that is availability and accessibility of food, utilization, and stability of food supplies. And before concluding, I would also like to briefly touch upon the issue of public stockholding for food security purposes and the ongoing negotiations for a permanent solution at the WTO. Recent work by international organizations such as the FAO show that PSH programs can and do provide important stocks and buffers to help contribute to food security. This work also shows that PSH programs can be costly to operate, and without being properly designed, disposal of stocks on domestic and international markets can lead to distortions and ultimately harm the food security of other members. Therefore, it's important that the development of a permanent PSH mechanism be based on data and evidence of the current programs. An evidence-based negotiation on a permanent solution on PSH would give the best chance to balance all members' interests and ensure that trade distortions and food security of other members are not harmed. In this context, and in response to the presentation that we heard, I do wonder why PSH stocks cannot be procured at market prices. To conclude, that the WTO has an important role to play to develop rules that reduce distortions, improve openness, predictability, and transparency in international markets that would support food security for all WTO members. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador M.O. And now I gave the floor to Ambassador Muhammadou Kah from Gambia.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to convey our appreciation to the WTO Secretariat for organizing such a very important and timely seminar, which I hope will be many such events as things escalate in the global community. I also want to thank our two presenters, Dr. Sachin Kumar Sharma, for a very valuable presentation and very insightful, as well as the presentation and insights that are shared by Dr. Peter Draper. What I would add here and join my colleague Stephen from Canada, and I appreciate his intervention as well. Over the last few years, multiple and persistent shocks have hindered the potential progress in transforming Africa and least developing countries' food systems. This was not helped with the challenges that we continue to experience during an ongoing COVID pandemic, and recently the evolving unfortunate conflict that had been a challenge to the global community in the Ukraine and Russia. This has exacerbated the food security and food insecurity and livelihoods, as well as jeopardized economic growth and that have been registered in the past decades. Our agricultural sectors have tremendous potential. I think we all agree on that. However, they're at an inflection point at this moment, and business as usual is no longer an option, neither in how we understand these sectors and how we recover from the systemic shocks that continue to challenge us. And we've had ideas around building back better during the COVID and post-COVID-19. Now with the escalating political crisis and the conflicts requires all of us, and which we've had in the morning, embracing a food systems approach to policy design and implementation. I think that is crucial in the way we approach what Peter had shared with us in his presentation, addressing the low-hanging fruits. Food systems around the world, in my mind, play three key roles. One is they provide food security and nutrition, and we must not ignore the centrality of nutrition as we try to have a grip on food security. Secondly, it also provides livelihoods for millions of our population. They contribute to the protection and enhancement of ecosystems. From the Africa perspective, in my mind, policymakers must also contend, and this applies broadly to least developing countries, with a set of challenges and opportunities that will shape any food system. One is the realities of demographic changes. Urbanizations and the rising unemployment is a reality that we grapple with. Secondly, I mentioned the centrality of nutrition. The shifting dietary patterns and double burden of malnutrition persistence in the gender gap is also a reality that we contend with. And of course, thirdly, the extreme climate events and environmental degradation. This continues to affect productivity and yields and affects food security in member states. Fourthly, socioeconomic shocks. For example, the recent conflict, protracted crisis, and pandemics. And if you go to in countries and regions, you have other conflicts that affects the farming communities and production and productivity. We also continue to be challenged by a growing young population in most of the member states. And of course, what was mentioned today, the importance of information and the importance of data, the transition to the digital economy, which most member states that are agriculturally dependent are hugely divided. The gulf is huge, but the opportunities are many to reinvigorate agriculture by smartening agriculture with embracing emerging technologies to influence productivity and yield. These complex challenges presented by the food system transformations will require complex solutions. It will require multi-sector industries, stakeholders that will achieve pragmatic and positive sum outcomes and consensus, despite that all members will be coming to approach agriculture from an interest perspective. The importance of food security goes beyond one member state. The opportunities and drivers for food system transformation in our countries include agricultural production and productivity, agro-processing, technology and digitalization infrastructure, as well as intra-regional and global trade, as well as social protection systems, and the centrality of investing in science, research, and innovation in our countries. So we must connect these dots with policy innovations for food systems to transform our member states to ensure food security. It will require reasonable and pragmatic negotiations for impactful outcomes to move the needle towards systems level change and transformation, true transformation in agriculture for a sustained food security ecosystem and value chains for our member states. We must focus, and it was highlighted earlier by the presenters, on policy and institutional innovations, as well as programmatic interventions. I will recommend a few things. One is to facilitate evidence-based and guided experimentation and innovation of policies, as well as to accelerate science capacity and technical solutions that will support broad food systems change. We also must institutionalize monitoring. It is very crucial that evaluation and learning for impactful planning and implementation is factored in our efforts. It is important to note the points that were shared by, I will just touch on Professor Dr. Samar's point on public stockholding programs and the importance of price stability, as well, especially for our farming communities. Also, the challenges of domestic versus global food security and the risks of PSH. On the risk of PSH, the point that was made on earlier, which is the importance of PHS that must be designed better, as well as be more adaptable to our unique context for our member states, as well as for it to be evidence-based with a pragmatic approach that will facilitate protection for distortions. The other point that was raised was on domestic support. Of course, domestic support is very crucial. And as Peter had mentioned earlier, it is a huge challenge for member states. So we need to work together to come up with mechanisms to ensure that we can have modalities for the reduction of entitlements that seems to be out of reach. And that was a point that was made. The other point that was concluded by Dr. Shamar was updating the ERP or adjusting it for inflation. As we know, as we get pressure on price distortions, as well as supply chain dysfunctionalities, the issue of disciplining the trade distortion becomes a huge challenge, and vis-a-vis the need to revisit practically a domestic support, and especially keeping in mind the challenges that least developing countries do have on subsidies that was highlighted by Peter. Also on market access. Export competition is also a challenge. The burdensome of transparency requirements for our member states is something that we need to factor in the discussions and in the dialogue. Specifically on Peter's presentation, some of the observations that I take is subsidies do distort and do create sometimes market signals that could be a challenge. It is very difficult for African countries, for example, or least developing countries that are challenged with fiscality, do not have adequate finances, and perhaps the challenges that our governments do have can be mitigated by perhaps a step-up role of institutions like the African Development Bank that can begin to explore innovative ways of subsidies to help reduce the burden of financing. The other point that was raised was on import tariffs. Our countries relies heavily on these import duties for augmentation of fiscality and funding of social programs. So protecting domestic and to protect domestic producers as well as food prices, whenever you have these rising shocks on price, it becomes a challenge for our domestic players. On Peter's point on focusing on the low-hanging fruits, I completely agree that it is important that we revisit the policy instruments and processes. Policy innovations from the top, meaning from permanent secretaries and above, are more likely to be adopted and faster to be implemented and to scale, hence to be very transformative. So revisiting the policy innovations become very, very critical as we try to ensure that we have the appropriate policy instruments. On the drivers of this policy innovation from the top, failed experimentations are very costly for our member states, both financially and politically. Also, the policy changes do require or must be guided by gradual versus the need for transformation scale. It is very important. I'm just trying to address the point that was made by Peter. Also, the importance of peer learning and imitations that will accelerate the pace of innovations that will result into a much more sustainable food security. There is an urgent need to reinvigorate and embrace evidence and dialogue, evidence-based dialogue for policy innovations. So we must continue our efforts of understanding positive changes around policy to find out where progresses are taking place in member countries and in our regions, and also to understand what works and how it works and why. This should feed into the institutional innovations as well as the policy innovations and program interventions, which will then enable us to have better learning for a positive change, which will lead to good practice in policy and program design and implementation, as well as facilitating dialogue and exchange for adoption. So this is what I wanted to quickly contribute into the discussion. And I will stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kah, for your insightful comments. And well, I would like now to give the floor to participants who wish to ask questions Again, I will alternate between the participants present in the room and those who have sent questions by email to ensure that everyone has the chance to ask questions. The floor is yours. United States, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the participants in this panel for a very enlightening discussion. I was particularly interested in Dr. Sharma's presentation, and I was trying to assess it through the framework of some of the earlier conversations we've had today. And I'm going to try and tease a couple things out, which I would welcome any response to. And so I thought about it in terms of Marian Jansen's discussion of facts, values, and interests. And I think what the presentation did a good job of, it showed that as a factual matter, there is a compliance issue with the PSH under the existing rules. And so I think that, there was a clear explication of that. I think as a factual matter, it also made the case that the PSH program in India has been effective at insulating the domestic market from the world market. And so that implicates some interests. And here, I think there's more work to be done in terms of measuring how this affects our interests. I feel in this room, too often we immediately ascribe an interest to a long entrenched position without having real empirical basis behind it. And I look forward to building on the factual presentation for us in the forward to really measure better our interests. And we had some conversations earlier today on that. And then finally, in terms of values, the presentation did a good job in terms of showing the effect of achieving an Indian value of insulating itself from the need for external supplies. But what we're particularly interested in is other values, including developing a resilient system that allows, in a moment of crisis, for all countries to have access to a world of suppliers. And in even normal times, that we can create a system that will promote production in the most efficient and sustainable members so as to address the long-term sustainability challenges that we have. So these are just some observations from my part. I'm appreciative in particular because it does show a way forward in terms of future discussions that is more grounded in realism and in openness about the current situation. So happy to hear any responses.
Thank you, United States. Dr. Sharma, you have the floor.
So if I get the correct question, is about how to do the efficient production, about the efficient production. Okay. Now, yes, about the efficient production, given the scenario in the most developing country, we have majority of farmers, low income, resource poor, their pervasive farm distress is there. Our farm size is very, very low. And here we have to ensure remunerative prices to these people to enhance their purchasing power. So this is one of the method through which the government procure the stocks, and then they distribute to the poor people. And this help a lot. This help a lot in developing country, in India specifically. We built the stock. We are distributing the stocks for the food security purposes. We have distributed 60 million tons this time. And this played a very important role in fight against hunger. There are many other ways are there. The government also giving the decoupled income support to the farmers. But this, besides this public stock holding is very, very important, because through this public stock holding, the government achieving two purposes. One, to price stabilization and giving affordable food to the poor people, as well as ensuring remunerative prices to the farmers. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. I have here one question for the two speakers. What are your view on the specific situation of small and vulnerable islands and landlocked countries regarding possible policies to enhance food security? Maybe we can start with Mr. Draper.
Well, thanks, Chair. I suppose much depends on how much food the particular island in question produces for itself. Generally speaking, I suppose not much. So they're going to be net food importers, but fisheries would be more important in those contexts, for instance, and that's also a source of protein and therefore important. But generally speaking, and I'll use my Namibia example again, if you're in a position where you cannot be effectively food self-sufficient, you're going to be importing from various sources for your local population. And then to me, it makes sense from a government point of view to import as cheaply as possible and as efficiently as possible, and to ensure the availability of food. So trying to protect your domestic farmer base through import duties, for instance, to me, it doesn't make sense in that context. I think there could be a case, depending on the geoeconomic situation that I was referring to earlier. In other words, the need to reduce vulnerability to pressure, external pressure, to think more carefully about who you're importing from. But that gets down to foreign policy decisions in the context of supply chain diversification and resilience. Very often, I suspect the businesses that will do the importing would be making those kinds of calculations anyway. But I also think there's a case for governments in the kind of world that we're in and that we're heading into to think much more carefully about such considerations.
Thank you, Mr. Draper. And well, it's 1 hour and 10 minutes. I would like to thank all the distinguished panelists and participants, as well as all those who follow by YouTube. The morning session was very informative and underlined the need for the adoption of effective measures to improve global food security and eradicate hunger. I hope that this discussion will help us to move closer to the goal. And I appreciate your participation this morning, and I declare the morning session closed, and we will restart at 3 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you so much.